We are students of the art of play,
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
a show for the players who ask why.
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Hey Gaia, what's our episode on today?
So today we're going to be digging into kind of one of our long-faded episodes for the past few weeks now, one that we've kind of been prepping for. Today we're going to be talking about Session Zeros, primarily focused in TTRPGs and other like tabletop-based games, kind of moving away from the video game discussion for the majority of today.
Mm-hmm.
And for this episode, we thought maybe we should get one of the experts in.
Ooh, one of the experts.
One of the people that we know in real life
Yeah.
who can say a lot more about this, at least than I can. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Mark. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Some people know me on the radio as Mark the Encaffeinated One. Some people know me on streaming as Mark the Encaffeinated One. I've been a gamer since I started university, actually, in 1991, and have been running games or playing games of every kind and every stripe pretty much out there. I own way too many games that I haven't yet had a chance to play even. And I've also, for a while, I hosted a show on the station called Head in the Game, which was all about talking with my friends about games. So if that qualifies me as an expert, then certainly. I've also just been fascinated with the whole structure of how games are made, and I think in the last decade we've seen an incredible revolution, actually, in understanding the understanding about games, stepping back from just the specific rules or just the specific setting, going, how do we explore this in brand new ways? And today's topic is one of those things that kind of came out of that.
I will ask you then, if you started playing in like the 90s, what edition of D&D was that?
That would have been second ed, advanced AD&D second ed.
Second ed.
Had to remember there for a moment.
Yeah.
But one of the games I was introduced to very early on was the second edition of Vampire the Masquerade, which had a very different style of game, a very different focus. And it was great that I had those two to play at the same time because they gave very different expressions of gaming. So right from the very beginning, I was already seeing gaming in two very different ways. And then there were a whole bunch of other games. There was Rifts, and there was, oh man, I can't even list all the ones that we're playing.
There's all of that like open content D&D stuff that also happened to branch out into there.
That happened about a decade later.
Yeah.
Honestly, it was mostly fan-driven in a way at the beginning with the sort of tomes that came from, at that point, TSR and I forget the Reinhagen company, White Wolf. But there was tons of fan content being created, including some wonderful mailing lists back in the day. I was a participant around 1994 in WOD-L, or World of Darkness-L, which was a fan-run list in which a number of people there were actually people who wrote for the company.
Oh.
So you could ping a whole bunch of stuff back and forth, but they also encourage you just to create your own settings as well. So, yeah, from the very beginning, it was always kind of role-playing is not one thing to me. Games are very, very diverse, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's a really insightful place to start your gaming career, to see that like whole renaissance, especially in the last like handful of my gaming career, of seeing just that renaissance of 5th edition kind of era in those games.
And it turns out that I could have been gaming for 4 years before that, but none of my friends told me they were running a game. And I lived in a rural area, so getting together was not as easy. I found out later when one of my friends in high school turned up to be one of the players in a game that I was running. And I went, wait, you were gaming all that time and you didn't tell me? So it would have been very different if I'd done that too, because it would have been very limited in the terms of games I would have seen. But I've loved games my entire life, and I love running games, although it can be a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I play, 3 or 4 games a week right now?
I feel like I've heard that story far too many times from people in my group. Turning to my wonderful co-host here. How many games?
Oh, me and my many games?
You and your many. How many?
I have 3 this week.
3 this week. Does that
week.
include our Friday game?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
The most I've heard is one of my friends who plays 5 games a week and runs 3. And if you add that up, there's more days. There are more games than days.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of sounds like an ideal kind of life.
Yeah, I mean,
does he make money off of it?
No, he's doing this for fun. But
wild.
Yeah.
There are people who make money off of gaming, which is also something unimaginable. When I started gaming, it was a fun hobby that was done, and you spent money. You didn't make money.
Yeah.
Okay, so as the listener, can hear, we did get our in-residence expert in for today's topic. So let me break down the structure of what today's episode is going to look like for everyone, for both our co-hosts and for the listeners. So today, after having completed the introduction, we're going to be talking about what is a session 0 for TTRPGs. So the fundamentals of what does it look like, what actually is it in concept. And we're going to move on to why should you, as a listener, as a DM or a player, care about session 0s. Then we're going to talk about more what does it include, what does it not include, like the general structure of a session 0. Before moving on to what happens if we miss something, and what about our own stories of what has happened when something's been missed or not included, or if we don't do a session 0, what happens. I think we all might have our own little stories of that, which led us to caring about today's episode. And then we're going to talk a little bit at the end about how do we expand upon this into other forms of media. That one's kind of a brief bit near the end I wanted to talk about, admittedly. But yeah, so let's begin with the basic idea of what is a session 0. And I'm going to pass this over to both of you as the co-host today and ask both of you, in your own view, what is a session 0 in TTRPGs? Let's start with Mark, our in-residence expert.
Oh, it's always dangerous to start with me, as I can talk forever. But a session 0 is really about everybody getting on the same page. It's about the players and the GM understanding what some expectations are going to be, what some limitations might be, and kind of the base understanding, the meta understanding of what the game is going to be. Kind of what you just went through, actually, about this episode. In some ways, that's setting out the high-level view of what this game is going to be and what it's not going to be. Also pretty important. So I think that's a kind of basic definition.
Yeah, I would even expand upon it to say that it's a conversation around the DM, where the DM might sit down and say, okay, we've agreed to play this game and we want to play sort of these themes and these tropes and that sort of thing. That's what we want to explore. Here's what I think we should prepare. Here's what I have prepared. What are your expectations for me? What expectations do I have for you? And then I think it also is very important that your session in 0 include stuff like player boundaries. How okay are you with spiders? How okay are you with romance in this story? That kind of thing. Your personal boundaries as a player.
Yeah, I can agree with both of those descriptions. For me, it's always just been telling my players, here's what's coming. I hope you're okay with it. And do you need to veto anything? Like, I know with my two most recent long-term games that I've done, my first one was, this is a standard beginner's fantasy RPG. We're going to go through everything. I'm going to learn how to DM. And in my second one, I was like, we're going to copy Metal Gear Rising Revengeance 1-1. That's the plot. If you're not in for that, don't join the game.
Well, and there was a word that you used called conversation, and I like that word, but the reality is closer to what your experience is, Gaia, where it is the GM or the GM who is setting out all of this stuff. They're the force that's really making this happen, and that is changing. I much prefer when the players kind of meet the GM on an even ground, but it really is still, just like in running a game, a GM is responsible for the world, and the players are just responsible for their individual character. It kind of feels like that balance still exists with Session 0, but the more it can be a collaboration, I think the more effective it can be, too. You get buy-in from all the parties.
Yeah, and I think we'll get there, but there's tools that I've encountered just in the community in general that are made specifically for Session 0s, like things like consent checklists and stuff like that to help facilitate that conversation. So a DM can sit down and go, here are our expectations, and because we've done some pre-work, I know what you're comfortable with. So that's what I now know, and I can show you that I know. I mean,
we're gamers. We're used to having a setting book with rules.
Yeah.
So the fact that we have a setting book with rules about Session 0 also feels appropriate. I think of at least one. I've seen at least one, which is itself its own little mini RPG that you play through to do Session 0.
I'm reminded of the one that's there's like a map building one of those that is just like, okay, the quiet year.
Yep.
We're going to play a year in the world, and then we're going to actually start our game.
Yep. And there's map building ones that are based on dropping dice and then determining where they are. And all of that is kind of the precursor to the actual game.
Yeah. And I think all of that is Session 0. I don't think a Session 0 necessarily is that 1 3-hour block that you set aside. It's kind of those conversations that happen when you're thinking about it.
Yeah, actually, that'd be interesting to reframe it, because session 0 implies the very before the beginning.
Yeah.
But you're right, that conversation is valuable anytime throughout the game. And I have actually had opportunities where we've done kind of a check-in where it's like, okay, what did you think about that? Did that bother you? And some of the safety tools you've mentioned are also meant to be done during the game to allow that conversation to continue when necessary.
Yeah, I have, there's a streamed game that my friend is setting up, and we're doing all kinds of session 0 stuff. Like, we're doing, linked player backstories, but even fundamentally, we're doing consent checklists and expectations from DM, and it's all just in a place where you can always access it. And then we'll have a conversation pretty soon here that is our proper, session 0, where it's that, we're all going to sit down and talk about it, but we all know what we're walking into for the session 0. So I think really at the heart of it, the session 0 is just, how do you set expectations well so that your expectations can be met and you feel like you're having a good game?
Yeah, and one of the big pieces of advice that I've seen, and I wrote it down and I remembered it, is you can't have everything. So no session 0 is going to be entirely covering everything. Just like when you have a rule system, you're going to have some table decisions, which are going to be like, well, that in this case, that rule doesn't make any sense. Or this time I'm ruling this way. And even those you might reflect on later and go, well, I don't really like the way that rule turned out. I know that I have changed downtime rules in my games like 5 times. I've gone to the point where I built an entire system and then I went, no, this is too much work. So the same thing happens with a sort of session 0. And maybe it needs another name, because while it implies that beginning, it really is an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, another name is a good thought experiment. We might come up with something by the end of this game, but I think even something as just simple as pre-game conversations or just
or metagame conversations.
Metagame conversations, yeah. Although that kind of lends itself to
it's
the villainous metagaming. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've covered what a session 0 is. And honestly, from the discussion that you two had, I've gotten a really good feeling for why we care about session 0s. Just as a quick summary of what I heard a lot about consent and expectations and knowing what you're getting into and preparing appropriately for a game. And talking about streamed games specifically, I heard a lot from you, Vi, about... Well, at least mentally, I took there's a lot of responsibility in a game that is streamed, and something that's much more dedicated, fixed, and important to the people there. And a lot of session 0s, maybe multiple session 0s, part 1, 2, and 3, might be necessary to prepare players for such a large investment into the game. When I tried to do my own stream game once, we never ended up recording it, partially due to COVID happening a week after we started. We never had a session 0. And looking back, that would have been a disaster. It would have been a very fun disaster, but would have been a disaster for a game. But I do have another question for you two. So I got an idea for what is a session 0 and why do we care. I want to get both of your opinions on what is not a session 0. What does a session 0 not include for a game? And I'll start with you, Mark. I can see you kind of nodding along. Seems like you have maybe an idea or two to throw out.
Well, one of the things I think that can get confusing is because we're calling it a session, people think of it like a session in the regular game, and it's not. You're not meant to be doing the role-playing. You're not necessarily going to be doing any dice rolling whatsoever. It's not that kind of a session. And I think that it can get a little confusing because, especially if you're a role player like me, you'll naturally want to drop into the character voice and do things, but you don't want to do that necessarily in the session 0. Session 0 is about being honest and open about what the character is, not necessarily how the character presents themselves. So I think that's one big distinction. Is just think about it not as a regular session. And well, go ahead and answer.
Well, I was going to say that I was just running with your train of thought there, but yeah, it is really interesting to say that this is who I am as a player, and here are things that I am hoping for my character. It's taking that step away from your character's goals and motivations and just going, these are things that I hope to happen. This is what I would like from the game if we can do that. And here's some strategies that I need as a player at the table for that.
Yeah, I think that last part's really important, too. It's what do I need? Because sometimes players can't express that in the middle of a session. You don't feel like interrupting the role play by saying, can you spell that? Or you may have that as a natural thing that the GM knows you want to write it down and get the spelling right, so they always type it in chat or they always make sure it's written out.
Yeah, I'm thinking about one of the games I played, Vi. This was an our Friday game originally, where I think I ended up, without even realizing at the moment, interrupting the game to ask one character their pronouns. which wasn't important in the moment because my character wasn't active in that scene, but I was like, wait, I have no clue how to refer to this person.
Yeah.
And I plan on referring to them when I speak next.
Yeah.
Right? So that was definitely even though we had a really good session 0, this was just a later joining player who wasn't part of that first session 0, it can lead to a lot of confusion for something super like small that you might end up forgetting really early on.
Actually, that's a really good point and gets back to our wanting to name it differently, because if a player joins midstream or midway...
Yeah, we can't call it session 0 anymore.
They weren't there too, so how do you make sure that they're informed of the decisions that were made at that particular thing? Another thing that session 0 is not a time to expose your players' innermost fears or things that they don't want to share. So session 0 is meant to be a collaborative group thing. But every once in a while, especially with some of the more sensitive matters, you really want to have that one-on-one between the GM and the player, because the player may not want to reveal some of their personal issues or difficulties with it. Probably they're fine with revealing their desires and expectations for the game, but I think a little sensitivity around, for example, if someone has had a trauma and they don't want to see that trauma, they may not want to tell everybody about that. So that's not part of session 0 in terms of the collective, but it is the conversation between the GM and the player that might be more private.
There is actually a tool for this that we'll be using in that upcoming stream game, which is just flags. So because we'll all be on video, it's just as simple as holding up, these colored cards that we have. That's like, if it's a red, we need a full stop. I need to have a conversation with somebody. I'm uncomfortable. If it's a yellow, it's like, I'm going to need to talk about this, but we don't need to interrupt right now. And then green being like, I'm good. Everything's fine.
Similar to that is the X card, which is usually a card placed on the table, and if anybody's uncomfortable, they point to the X card. Yeah. And usually it means roll back what just happened, or we have a small discussion about why that was bothersome. That
would have been a really good... I was in a game that I joined last year, and I encountered a mimic, and I was like, oh, well, kill it, monster. Because that's my expectation was when I encounter a monster, it's inherently bad. And this group of players are people who, see beauty in things like bugs and like bones in the woods and stuff like that. So everybody at the table went, oh my God, what's happening? Like, no, stop. And I was like, okay, we might need a tool to just tell me what's happening here, because I wasn't part of your session 0. I don't know what your expectations are for the game. And that was clear later, right, that we needed a way to sort of roll down the momentum of a game for a second and roll something back.
Well, and then that's one of the aspects of session 0 is, what is player versus player, or really character versus character conflict like? Sometimes that kind of conflict can be really fun. You have one person who's dead set against all monsters, and other people are like, no, they're cute and cuddly and just misunderstood. Yes, it's eating my hand, but that's okay. And that can be really fun role-playing as well, but it can be jarring if one person is like, I kill everything and take their stuff, and the others are like, wait a minute now, we need to negotiate this.
It's when you walk in sort of knowing that one character is going to respond with, I'm going to kill it, and the other character responds with, it's cute, it's fine, I'm in danger, but I think it's okay. There's a very different sort of set of expectations you walk into that with. One is, where I was coming from was just uninformed, right? So it didn't become a nice role play moment because I didn't know what the problem was. Right? And that's at the heart of this expectation, session 0, just game expectations.
And how you record these things and how you tell people and how you remind them, that's the trickiest part, I think.
I think so too.
Okay, so I think we have a good idea for what a session 0 is and what a session 0 is not. So I'm going to ask one more question on this topic before I move on to the really, what do we include, what do we not include? I know we've covered that a little bit, but kind of really getting into the weeds of that one. So let's say you're doing a game that has somewhat of a public audience, streamed game, or spectators, or friends joining in, any of the sort. Should your session 0 be streamed? Or should part of it be streamed? So I'll pass over to both of you again. What's your opinion? Should you stream a session 0? Now, we're going to exclude all the one-on-one conversations that we discussed. Those aren't really part of the session 0. They're kind of the pre-prep between the DM inviting people. So you're reaching session 0. Do you stream it? Why or why not?
My instinct to this is that every streamed game is a performance, basically, in that, this is a theater production. We are doing improv up here, but there is something happening. There's a system for how these things happen. when you pull back the curtain to how did we arrive at how this game is presented, I think you lose some of the beauty of what a stream game is, right? You might lose some of that, like, okay, my character has this secret, and the secret is this, and that happens like behind the scenes, so you get to role play it for the audience later. If you show them that up front, I think we lose some of that. But there's also, something to be said for, discussions about trauma and lines and veils that you might just not want to talk about in front of your audience.
Yeah, I've been playing in a stream game. I think this is 6 years, something like that now. And I don't think we really started with much we're in a second campaign now. We didn't really start as much with that, and then we switched up some of the players and had a different scenario for the second one. I think you're right in terms of it being a performance, which is something that I don't think every streamed game thinks of. When I'm doing, I've also been streaming my own game for 4 or 5 years now, and there's an expectation of what you're going to be delivering to the audience, and that's one of the definitely off-screen conversations you probably need to have, because it's not going to be interesting to your audience. I think there's a sort of both answer here, which is always one of those terrible answers, because you want to have some things which are about the game that you don't think are going to be interesting or informative to the audience, but I think you do want to have some of that conversation in public. How you segment that might be difficult. It might be the kind of thing where you record the whole thing and then you go, yeah, we're going to take these bits out. Or it might be the kind of thing where you very clearly delineate what's going to be in the private one, just because you are discussing things about maybe the form. For example, when you're doing a stream game, you typically don't want to devolve into side conversations, right? That makes it very distracting. They typically don't record well because you have multiple conversations going on behind microphones.
This is one of the reasons I have a hard time watching Critical Role, because there's so many people and they're doing so many different things. I have a really hard time like listening to that podcast or even watching it online.
Yeah, I've watched it from the very beginning and watched them evolve over time. Now, all of them are performers, so there's a certain built-in set of skills and set of expectations and understandings they have. But even then, they're also still players and a GM, so you still have some of that element. And you'll even see Matt Mercer sometimes go, okay, look, enough with the side conversations. We got to do this moment.
There's one really good moment, just as a like specific example, where Liam's character in the first campaign is sort of opening the floor for a heart-to-heart with Keyleth, with Marisha's character, and Marisha just sort of gets the giggles and gets like kind of excited about it, and Matt has to do something I've seen directors do in theater, which is the like, hey, hang on, like focus up right here, this is happening now, which is something that they have as part of their skill set, that we don't need to see in a session zero because it's happening at the table, but it is one of those things that you can't really like plan for. You don't know how your player's going to respond to something that's happening.
Yeah, some of the other elements that definitely would be in front would be things like setting elements that you want to share. Critical Role is an interesting example because they're kind of the leading professional group that does this, and they're also coming from professional backgrounds that lead into it very well. People can't beat Critical Role because they've done this for many, many years, but it's interesting to use it as an example. And they do have character secrets and those sorts of things that clearly have been discussed at other times that they don't reveal because they want it to be a dramatic reveal on stream. But they also do have notions of collective setting elements that they want people to communicate. And that's, I think, especially with the setting elements, doing those in a more public way in a setting zero that might not be discovered during play but is actually set out already, that's something that you would want to have for people to understand.
Yeah.
You'd probably also want to explain these are the safety tools we're using, just so that there's suddenly an X somewhere and no one knows why that's there, and suddenly the story changed and no one knows why. Well, if you set that out in your session zero public, then people know, oh, okay, we've touched on something, and they're backing off on that. And it could be good demonstration of how they're used as well. This is one of the weird obligations of when you start to be a performer, you start to think, well, how am I representing the thing I'm performing?
Yeah, you have that responsibility for the game that you're playing.
Yeah.
I think there's also like those tools and things could be presented in sort of just another episode in a talk back or something like that, or even kind of a prologue type narration, just to say those things like straight up front. They don't necessarily need to be, the actual session zero as it happened, but they might just be a little recap of the conversation. Or
the conclusion, or like we were saying, recording all those things to understand what people can who'll join in later, But the majority of session zero really is meant to be private. It's really meant to be an open discussion where anybody can mention anything. So it can be the kind of thing where someone's like, I just want to kill things and take their stuff. And others are like, yeah, that's not going to work for us. Well, that's not something you want to have necessarily public.
Yeah.
Granted, you want to make sure, especially in a streamed game, that you have some understanding what the expectations are going to be, so that when you have that first session and one character's killing puppies and the other players are just standing back going, what is going on here? Because no one, you don't want that necessarily to have that kind of surprise at the table. Unless, some player groups are willing to run with it too.
Yeah, so. I think it's different to have a narrative surprise than it is to have like a genuine surprise from somebody else at your table where you're like, I just didn't expect that. Like we had these expectations and you've broken them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Gaia, what do you think?
What do I think about including session zeros in podcasts?
What do you think?
Yeah, I had to ask because I was listening to the conversation go around. I'm like, at which point is this question coming from? I agree with the idea that once you are producing something publicly, this layer of responsibility and of representation has come upon you. It's become your job to ensure that the people who watch your content are taking away not just entertainment, but good things from it. And so showing a session zero, maybe not the first session zero setting up the podcast, but a session zero of setting up your characters, setting up the themes, the ideas, maybe not the secrets because, narrative flair, but setting up all these things and showing players how is a sense of responsibility that you as a streamer have to really put on to your viewers. Make sure they know how to do it, and that when they inevitably try to copy you, if you've seen all the Matt Mercer clones at this point with D&D.
I would love just an hour-long episode with Brennan Lee Mulligan about where did you come up with a crown of candy? I need to know what I really want to know, what happens behind the scene when you have a PC death in a game like that. What do you do? Where does that new character come from? I just want to look at his DM binder,
Yeah, the same thing from Matt Mercer. There was a still photograph of behind the screen of his prep notes once, and I took that and went, oh my God, I can do better.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that I want more session zero type things to be in public, just so that I can learn from them too. Because that's the other sort of weird thing is, your session zeros, if they're always private, nobody knows how you do them.
Yeah, you walk this line of I kind of want it to be secret, because I've got my special DM recipe back here and nobody else gets to know the secret ingredients for it. But I've also got this kind of, if you're willing to teach, maybe that's where you release your session zero, right? If you think that you are experienced enough or you have something really good to offer, maybe then you open up your session zero to the public, right? You go, this is the discussion we had.
There are books and articles written about how to do session zero, but they often stop before they give specific examples, which seems like the most important part to me.
Yes.
How does this really manifest at the table? How is this, when does this come up? And it's it does. Well, I need to know a specific here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I still feel that if you're producing content for the public, you've already taken on this. People are going to try to copy your responsibility. So it does fall upon you to at least leave a good influence rather than no influence, if that makes sense. Although both are still better than a bad influence. So I think that really covers what is a session zero, what is a session zero not, and when do you do them? Do you include them in everything or nothing, or what? How does that work? So let's move on to the kind of big question that I think anyone listening to an episode about session zeros would want. What do you include in a session zero? What topics should really come up? And more of let's hit a bunch of them and make sure people listening can just start jotting down notes and reasons why. So I want to ask both of you to give me, let's say, 3 to 5 key items that you cannot do a session zero without.
If we frame this discussion as we have a group of players and we're going to play this particular game and we kind of have a setting in mind, I think that gives us a good launch pad for the next step.
Yeah, I actually kind of want to answer the question by stepping back one step. It's going to do session zero on your question here. Just because when I was sitting down to think about what is in a session zero, I really had 4 different general areas which have a lot of very specific things around them here. One, we mentioned setting, for example. There's a lot of questions about setting which can be established and understood at a session zero. Another one is the rules, because not only the rule set you're using, but any special rules and things like that. Another one is character, which is both in terms of the expectations of the characters and what the characters are going to be in their projections. And then the final one is mood. because that is one thing that kind of spans all of those different things and can be very different. You can play the same game with two different moods, and it'll be a very, very different game. So those are kind of the 4 general areas I had scoped out, and I think I've got about, I don't know, 50 things written around those at the moment. So 3 to 5 might be difficult for me, but those are 4, so that technically counts.
Yeah, that's 4 areas, and that's exactly kind of what I was going for. The 4 big things you want to bring up in a game. I want to actually focus in on mood for a second before I pass over to you, Vi.
I actually wanted to do this too, because we've been talking about mood as sort of theme. The way I've been thinking about it is like, what animation style is this? Right? Like, are you doing, something that's very like happy, but it's an adult cartoon kind of thing? Like, where does your narration kind of live? So something like The Owl House, right? Where it's like, this is kind of like a kid's cartoon. It's kind of funky, and you have expectations based on that. And then they're like, but all the monsters are super weird. Like it's one of those things where like, it's the fun twist you put on your theme in your mood.
Yeah, I mean, I would say theme is one of the things I would include in mood. I also included things like seriousness. Is it something where you want the players to, through their characters, to take the moment serious? Because then you're going to have a very different kind of set of explorations for things. If someone's always, deflating the situation, then there may not be the impact you're looking for from the story that's going on. Another one is competitiveness. Is this where we're going to have player versus player competitiveness? Is everybody fighting to get that item, or is everybody trying to win the game, which is a whole other discussion on its own? There's things of style, for example. Is it meant to be mostly an improv or a combat or an RP thing? Those are more mood, I think, than rules or setting.
I think so too.
Because you can kind of decide, how you're going to approach a problem. Are you expecting, we've reached a problem, okay, we're going to have 45 minutes of in-character discussion about this?
Yeah.
Or is it roll for initiative?
Yes. Is this the sort of thing where I expect player characters to solve my puzzle, or where I expect the players to solve my puzzle?
Yeah, very much so. Well, that's another one. Plot versus puzzle versus combat versus RP, and how you approach a situation. If people love puzzles and you never give them puzzles, they're going to be puzzled.
That's really funny, actually. I specifically told one of my DMs, like, I love puzzles. Like, if you can give me a riddle that I can like go work on throughout the week, and I can come back and like role play that my character solves it, I would love that. That would be so fun for me.
Well, and there's an interesting distinction, because whether the player solves it or the character solves it, sometimes you want to set the tone like, no, always play through your character. So even if you figure out the riddle, you have to show how your character, who may not be as smart as you, how they try to solve the puzzle, maybe fail along the way, but you're also maybe laying down the narrative hints that all the other players and their smarter characters can pick up on what the accidental discovery was by your character.
Yeah.
Or it might be like, no, you can solve the puzzle. I don't care about that. It doesn't matter how it gets solved.
Yeah. I think those are really, really important things. In my family's home game, I've used this example before, but I gave them a cipher literally as part of my like narrative structure. But yeah, there's like spies here, and they're like passing clues between things. And I, handed it to my brother. My brother just read it. I was like, okay, like that's fine, I guess. And then later, they revealed unwisely that they knew that the ciphers existed and that they could read them in the presence of the person who was responsible for them. So the next time they encountered one, it was harder. And my family sat there for an hour and a half because they also really like puzzles. But we had this, expectation of like, oh, well, I thought we were going to have, a longer session of, something more fun like last session where we did like some combat. We had some more like RP stuff. And this was very much, we all sat here by ourselves and, worked on puzzles.
And you also get that contrast. Someone who loves puzzles and is terrible at them. But they're playing a smart character.
Yeah.
And so it might even be the case where the GM gives you the puzzle, gives you lots of hints, maybe even gives you the answer, but you're still expected to play it out. You're still expected, like, what the answer is of this, but how does your character interpret that? That's starting to get into the story elements of how that plays out versus, how the mechanics or how the players play the game. One other thing I want to mention here in terms of mood is the danger level. So in some games, it is totally cutthroat. Your character can die by the dice, and there's no chance of resurrection. Going to make up a new character for next week. Other games, there's more like plot armor, where it's like, well, we're going to make it dangerous, but know that your character's not going to die. And I've done that in games because I've got long-term plots that I want to build around characters. And if they just suddenly disappear, I lose a lot of my narrative prep that I've done, or a lot of my plotting prep that I've done. And so I don't want to do that. Plus, the players might not want to play a game in which they're losing their character friends all the time. And so that's part of the mood too. And you may want to have it where it's deadly dangerous, but there's relatively easy resurrection. So death for a character is a setback, not a permadeath, or not a stopping.
What is it is it Call of Cthulhu that has the insanity?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, it's one of them, but it's the biggest one.
Yeah, it's the one where you bring like 5 characters to the table because you expect to die pretty quick.
Well, or you expect your characters to get really weird.
Yeah.
As they start to stack up insanities and start to become less effective. They know more and they can see more, but they see more, and it's terrible for them.
Yes.
Yeah, that's one of the ones that expects that. D&D is often done that way. If you ever play, I haven't played, I think one session actually of the Adventures League for D&D, for example. That one's meant to be ruthless. Your character will die, and they may or may not get resurrected, but you're not necessarily going to leave them with the same group of people next week.
Yeah.
So the expectations are very different in that kind of setting. But if you're running a long-term narrative game and your character just randomly dies in the middle of some session, you're like, that kind of ruins the whole thing.
Yeah, you have whole things that you have planned for that character and hopes and expectations, and then to run into an encounter that's just like slightly too hard or more dangerous than you thought it was going to be, it can be really disappointing.
Yeah. If I may jump in here and ask for a bit of a story about mood to kind of get the idea down. Vi, in one of our recent episodes, we discussed a game that was centered like a Candyland murder mystery.
Yes. Okay.
Do you think you could give us a quick rundown on that type of game, or just in general, to get the idea of why it's so important for us to discuss mood?
Yes. This is, again, the Dimension 20, Brennan Lee Mulligan's A Crown of Candy, which is the Game of Thrones, but it's Candyland.
Okay.
So when I first started watching, I was like, oh, this is going to be like a fun little romp, and they're going to go do like princess things, and that's going to be, very entertaining. And then I was like, wait, but Game of Thrones. And in the first 3 sessions, one of the character almost dies as many or more times because there's an assassination attempt, happening. So there's this like sense of huge danger, and the stakes are like way up there, and there's 2 player character deaths, and you can see that the players know that that's a possibility as soon as they're getting attacked, and it's like, the odds are against them. They're not like, oh, it'll be fine, Brennan won't do that to us. It's very much like, we could very well die. So you can see the players get like emotional when they realize one of their characters is going to die, but not so much so that it's, game breaking. They just know that there's going to be.
Yeah. So imagine going into like a new TTRPG, a new game, and your DM tells you, we're playing in Candyland, but it's Game of Thrones, and it will feel like Game of Thrones, but Candyland.
Well, to give another example, Matt Colville, in his Chain game, he had a game where this is his first, I think, streamed game. Matt Colville is very well known for being kind of one of the commentators on RPG things, and if you go watch his series of videos, they're fantastic. But in the Chain, the very first episode, the Chain is based on a group of heroes. They're all essentially, they're not paladins, but essentially paladin-like characters all working for this organization. In the very first episode, a demon comes through, smashes the organization to bits, and outright kills one of the player characters with no roll. And people watching this went nuts. They said, what the heck are you doing? This is terrible GMing. What are you thinking about? And it came out after 2 or 3 sessions that was an agreement between Matt Colville and that player saying, I'm going to play this character. And Matt said, I want to emphasize how dangerous things can be, so I'm going to kill that character in the first session. And the player went, sure, I can deal with that. But the audience didn't have that expectation, so it really, really shocked them. And the audience was 2 kinds. The audience was those that are there for the story and those that are there for the game. And those that are there for the game were like, I was looking at this as an example of how to run games, and I think you just messed this up entirely in the first episode. And that's also where mood is important. While they were definitely in a desperate situation, it wasn't understood that it could be that dangerous. And again, he was setting it without a session 0 or an expectation for the audience. He was setting it by demonstration, but in a way where the audience was confused about what they were supposed to expect.
That's a show don't tell, but but there wasn't any sort of telling it all.
And in the backlash of that, in his own videos, he started to tell people like, no, this was intentional. This was completely intentional. And he did that kind of non-apology. I'm sorry you were upset.
Yes.
Rather than I'm sorry I upset you. But it is an interesting example, though, of that mood and the expectation set.
I think on the other hand, if I'll do one about there's this wonderful game called Wander Home, which I think I've told you about.
I've played it.
Oh, yeah, excellent. Okay, I had friends over, and I was like, we're gonna play Wander Home, and I want you to like toss out everything you think you know about tabletop RPGs. Just go put it in a little box. Don't do any prep. Like, come down, sit down, bring snacks. Here's what I want you to bring. You know, like brie and cheese and and cupcakes and stuff. And I was like, and that's part of setting the mood and the tone for, you know, this is going to be a very cozy game where we all get to narrate and we're all part of everything. It's all part of, you know, a shared experience that is very comfortable.
You know, my experience with Wander Home was we're going to play Wander Home tonight in the stream game because some players can't make it. So I really didn't have any chance to even absorb what that was all about. And it was actually kind of hard to get into that mode because it works in a very different way. And it's much more whimsical. It's much more playful. It's much more of the moment. You can do just about anything.
Yeah.
You're not limited in that way, which you're normally used to. But it was a very interesting experience. But yes, expectations had to be set to really understand it properly.
I found, just as a little tangent, J Dragon's games are fantastic for breaking the mold of like the GM player dynamic, because every game that I've played with my friends that has been J's, they tend to be very collaborative in their narration. So we've played Wander Home, but we've also played Sleepaway, and my friends are constantly asking to play Sleepaway again, right? Because it's sort of a horror summer camp thing, but you're in charge of your own horror. So you end up creating this like shared experience that's very like spooky and eerie and like feels creepy, but you're all doing it together, and that's a really that's a strength of that game, I think.
Yeah, there's one I haven't played. I think it's called 12 Candles, in which you play it in the dark with 12 lit candles, and as certain elements go on, you blow out one candle after another.
Oh, I don't like that at all.
So it's meant to be spooky. But you really want players who are going to engage with the spookiness and not just be cracking jokes to lighten the mood.
Absolutely.
Right. So that sort of thing really makes a difference.
And when you're doing a one shot and we have a session 0 for that, it can be as simple as we're gonna blow out candles, so like be serious about being spooky. Like it doesn't have to be, you know, an essay on what I would like the theme of this game to be. It can just be, we're going to blow out candles, and I expect you to play along. You
know, one of the things you mentioned earlier, too, which fits in this mood discussion, which is really fun to play, but it's also hard and does divide people, is romance.
Yes.
You know, if you don't have, first of all, you want the players to kind of consent if they're going to have romances between them, because otherwise it gets really awkward. And you also kind of want to know whether that's something as a GM you want to explore, whether you're putting potential romantic partners around and how they're going to react and all that sort of thing. And I think it's one of the least, I think the least developed and the least promoted aspects of role playing. It seems weird to me because it feels like a natural part of all of that, but that people are like, oh no, I don't want my serious, you know, fighter to, you know, do smoochy things. That seems terrible.
One of my friends is running a game of Cyberpunk, which is, you know, terrifying. It's horrible. Like it's genuinely very scary. And I walked in and I went, how many of your NPCs are romanceable? And because I know my friend, right, I was kind of joking, and they just went, all of them. And I was like, excellent. Like I fully know my expectation. Right?
Yeah, well, and that's interesting to see. You know, I know you want to talk a little bit about the crossover into other genres, other things, but that's a thing in video games. People are starting to add more and more romanceable elements, usually optional.
Yeah.
Sometimes a little more core to the plot, and they change the way that things work out. You know, some characters are a little more loyal or not so loyal, depending on how it works out. And I feel like it kind of depends upon the game, the people you have around the table. I tend to insert romanceable elements into my games, and some players are like, yeah, I'm not really interested, so they don't really pay attention to it, or they do it for plot elements, but they're not really interested in the actual, you know, romance. Probably in your session 0, you're going to describe how graphic and specific you might get.
Do we want to do a fade to black, or do we want to do explicit detail? Like, where are our boundaries here?
And then that's another technique called lines and veils that's just put together, which is where's the line you're not going to cross and where are you going to fade to black. And oftentimes romance is one of those places where people fade to black. But I find it interesting to kind of explore that, both in a sort of narrative sense as well as a PC. I've had a character who declared his love for someone, was one of the other player characters. And I had been hinting, it's funny, it's a funny story, I'll be very brief, but I had been playing this up for months. All of the other players saw it, except for the target, which was perfect.
Oh, that's excellent.
And so when he finally went, like, no, I'm in love with you, both the player and the character kind of froze and ran off, and then started talking to the other characters. And, and everybody, the character was like, yeah, I knew that. And it was really funny. The characters did end up marrying in the future. He made grand gestures and all that, but it was a fun arc to explore. And in my current one, I've made the character kind of very shy and young, and then he suddenly has a crush on an NPC.
Yeah.
And I'm having fun with that, and the other players are also having fun with it. Part of this is also to remind you that players should be fans of each other, right?
Absolutely.
And support these other things. Even if you're not part of the scene, you can be there watching the scene, and you can be absorbing it and trying to feed into that element indirectly through your player.
Yes.
Or through your character.
Yeah, I think...
Okay, I'm going to jump in here because
okay.
we are very behind.
Did you expect this to be one session?
Yeah.
Yes.
Our session 0 has a 0.5.
Okay, so kind of keeping on the theme of what should be included in a session 0, I want to talk about a speech that I give to my players at the start of every game that I have done since my first game. This was when I was researching for my first ever streamed game. I found this on Reddit from a user named r/Reddit_bull_worm, and I'm saying it because he asked to be cited if you use it in a podcast at the bottom of the post. And it's talking about metagaming. So access to books, access to materials, access to previous information or outside of the game information. And I'll read a little bit of it. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it has a massive paragraph at the end that's not worth it. But it says, the world we journey in is not defined by any texts or foretold tales. The books that lay before us, like the player's handbook, can be helpful in understanding this place, but should not be relied on for fact regarding history, trivia, metrics, or details of one's foe. You need not worry about metagaming by using one of these books in my table. All that is found within represents information that one would likely find in a nearby library or from a local historian. And if you go to these lengths in our game, your character is entitled to all the knowledge they hold. This includes the stat blocks that are listed for the species covered, which represent setting appropriate estimates and anecdotes detailing the appropriate metrics based on personal accounts and encounters. It's worth noting that as historical estimates and anecdotes often are, the player's handbooks and other such guides are often inaccurate and completely incomplete, or certainly incomplete. What if the Great Basilisk really only has 4 legs, but the last time anyone fought one, the lone survivor was a knight who suffered horrible brain damage, blurring his memory of the event? And it goes on to detail about that, of you can't trust these books, but they give you an estimate that it's okay to have.
This is really relevant for games that I play in where DMs will reskin monsters. Be like, yeah, I like what this thing can do, but doesn't look like that.
Yeah, I think this is getting into one of the things that as a GM I do get annoyed by, because I want the players to always filter what they know and how they know it through the lens of the character. And if it's reasonable for the character to know it, then I have no problem. If it's not reasonable for the character to know it, they're a farmer in the middle of nowhere. How do they know about the details about this dragon and how it works? You know, they would know legends, but they wouldn't know specifics. And I always want to kind of reinforce that, partially because there's a bit of surprise that can happen, partially because, you know, I want the characters to approach solving the problems from their perspective, not from yours.
This is where the player might do I understand, you know, X about this monster? And then a DM might go, okay, well, why don't you roll history for it? Or might just say, no, you wouldn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of the same thing between, you know, puzzles and ciphers. It's like I still want it to be through the lens of the character, even if you figured it out 10 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask each of you a question now. I feel like we have an idea for what goes into a session 0 in broad strokes, because we're never going to get all the way into discussions of alcohol at the table. Maybe should you have your phones or not, or topics of exactly homebrew and EXP and game mechanics, which we mentioned you have to talk about, but most people should do it by the book starting off and figure it out as they go for that kind of stuff. So let me ask both of you, what do you do when you miss something in a session 0, or don't even have the chance to have one at all? How do you handle that situation?
Wow. Do you want to go first?
Oh, I'm just thinking about Guy and I do a Friday game. And at one point, we actually ran into a roadblock because we hadn't done sort of a proper session 0, because we all wanted to play really quickly. And the format of that game, like, you know, it's pretty loose anyway. So we all built the world together and then just jumped right in at, like, right that day, that session, we drew the map, built the world, and I was like, okay, and you all kind of know your characters, pick a place where you're from, let's go. And then we were running into a roadblock where it was like people had some backstory and didn't have some other backstory, so they didn't know what was secret and what was just not known. So we were running into this point where characters were trying to have interactions, and it was like where I had to just reach forward and sort of go, okay, so that's not a secret that they're trying to keep from you. They don't know that information, and we're going to have to go and talk about that. So we're going to have to do, a conversation that is kind of a session 0 about specific things, but we're going to go do it, later. And it's when you hit roadblocks is, I think, when you realize what you've missed.
Yeah, I mean, a player may show up at the table barely having a name scrawled on their sheet, and some others will come with a 25-page background.
Yeah.
So that's always going to happen. I think that don't ever be afraid to have a 0.5 somewhere. Between two sessions, it's not a real session. It's, okay, we need to talk about this stuff. And I understand, too, like, that enthusiasm, you want to get right to the game is going to happen a lot. And it doesn't really sound as exciting to have a session 0 until you've encountered some of those roadblocks.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's better just to go and barrel on through until you hit those. Hopefully you don't hit the terrible roadblocks or the terrible situations. And you just, now you know why this is important. I see this now more and more important, but it's still hard to get my players to do it. I tried to tell my players in this campaign, don't make up your characters until we get to the table.
Yeah.
Of 3 players, 2 characters were already completely made with backgrounds, and they were firm on them. Nothing could change. The other one kind of went, well, I've got a general idea, and that character kind of formed a little bit from there and then changed a bit. And it frustrated me because it was an opportunity lost to do more collective work. I think that part of it is anytime you have a moment like that, a roadblock, write it down. Make it in a common place that everybody can get to, and make a record of it, partially because next time you run a game, you now have a starting point to go, okay, these are some of the things we encountered. We need to make sure we're on the same ground. And you may make different decisions. This is going to be a comedic game. I don't mind having that sort of thing. This is going to be a weekly game. This is going to be, online. Those are part of your session 0 discussions as well.
And I think the more you play, the more you understand what's important to include, right?
Oh, yeah.
When I hit a roadblock that's like, oh, we didn't talk about that, then I get to do it next time. I get to do it better. I think the other thing here is that when you find things that you have missed, that record, your like secret DM, recipe book has to be something that you can keep, but that you can also share with other people, right? Okay, one of my really good friends wants to try DMing, never done it before. Here is some things that I have learned that you should include, and you're welcome to take it, like we're doing in this episode, right?
Are you referencing that Discord call you and I had that was like 3 hours long of me giving you all my DM advice?
Certainly not. That
I wrote
doesn't seem like something I would
26
do.
points of advice.
Yeah, I did get sort of info dumped on,
You did.
which was really fun. But
So we're coming into the last few minutes, and I wanted to take a moment for our listeners who come here for the video game side of things to say, how do you recognize when games do a session 0? And I have the quick answer to this quickly. Most games, like video games, attempt to include a session 0 as part of their tutorial or their early discussion. And you as a player might know when a game has done its quote-unquote session 0 well, when the game doesn't surprise you but makes you still feel amazing within your expectations. And I look back to my favorite video game session 0 I've ever seen, which this is going to sound very silly, but it's for the game Doki Doki Literature Club. Because here's its session 0 on its store page. It says, "Hi, Monica here. Welcome to the Literature Club. It's always been a dream of mine to make something special out of the things I love. And now that you're a club member, you can help make that dream come true in this cute game." And it goes on to talk about the characters. And at the very end, in bold text, is written, "This game is not suitable for children or those who are easily disturbed."
yes.
And that right there screamed at me that this game is going to make me cry.
Yeah.
I didn't finish it. I made 1 hour into the first scene. If you've played it, you know what I mean. And immediately Alt F4 and never opened it again.
Yeah.
Right? But that told me what was coming. I was never surprised by that game. I was constantly in a state of when's it going to happen, because the game adequately communicated this to me. So you as a DM or you as a player are looking to adequately communicate to your players the expectations, not so there's no surprises, but so that when there are surprises, they're good for the player. And I think that's really what we're hitting at. The player expects the ideas, but can still have fun within the bounds that have been created. So that's pretty much everything that I have. Kind of giving a chance for you two to close off. Any final words before we end off this episode?
Wow. There can be a lot of stuff in here. And I wrote about, like I said, 50 points down on my sheet of paper, just kind of thinking about this. Part of it is thinking about having that conversation is the most important part. Whether you do any of these specific points or whatever, having the conversation about expectations will open up both for the GM, the potential plots and potential avoidances, and will open up for the player the things that they can get excited about. And so even if you just have that and you condense it down to even a few minutes, it will make a difference. As you get more experienced, you're going to want to have very specific questions, or you're going to want to have more collaborative elements, or you're going to want to have more things which you need to think about. But start with the conversation and understand where people are, and then revisit that conversation from time to time.
I think it's important that our session zeros are framed as conversations that are kind of guided by the DM or the GM. Where, we know what's expected kind of the conversation. We're all going to come in and I'm going to tell you some things and you're going to tell me some stuff. And then we're going to talk about, those things that we're unsure of. And then leaving that door always open.
So I think that covers everything we have. So thank you all for listening. I've been Gaia.
I've been Vi.
I'm Mark.
And we'll see you all next time. And if you want to hear more from us or listen to past episodes, tune in live every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic on CHSR 97.9 FM in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And if you're online, you can listen live at chsrfm.ca or on your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you next time.